My basic training for the Air Force was at Air Force Base. After that, I was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base for technical school. After my graduation, I received orders to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. There, my job was aerospace mechanic. At first, I started on the night duty, unfortunately, so my sleep schedule was basically non-existent. My duties basically were lugging plane parts like anti-ice valves, igniters, ignition exciters, sensors, and more from the warehouse to the flight line. It was, for the most part, boring, repetitive work, especially at night. A lot of sitting around and playing games on my phone, but nobody heard that from me. It had to be like 3 a.m. at this point. I was waiting for the other guy to come drop off some parts to the flight line. He'll be referred to as Dan for the purpose of this story. I was waiting by the back cargo area of the plane we were working on at the time, sitting on a box, scrolling through my phone. Dan was taking an incredibly long time with his delivery, so I shot him a few texts. When they went unresponded to, I tried calling him a few times. The calls rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I figured he was either screening his calls, lost his phone, or was just very busy at the moment. I waited and waited and he never showed up. Eventually I got a call from Dan's number. So I picked up, but it wasn't Dan's voice on the other end. It was some random guy. He sounded like a grown man in his 45s. He said he saw I tried calling a few times and said he found this phone on the ground outside of the base. I described what Dan looked like and asked him if he had seen anyone who may have resembled him. He said he had not. It's not like he would have been allowed on the base, so my only option was to drive out there and meet him. I asked him where he was and he gave me the name of a nearby joint where I agreed to meet him. I walked to my car, which was parked in the closest parking lot, and I drove off the base towards the place he told me to meet him. While I was mid-drive, I remembered Dan was sharing his location with me. Long story, but we basically met these 2 girls this one night while off base, who we separated from each other with. We, as a joke, started sharing our locations with each other in case we got quote-unquote murdered, as we kept joking. We joked about it mainly because we met them at a sketchy dive bar, but I'm not about to get into that. The place the man on the phone told me to meet him was called Tony, the closest town to the base. I pulled up the location of Dan's phone, and it checked out. It showed Dan's phone location right next to Tony. This begged the question, what was that man doing there this late at this hour? The place wasn't open, and there were 0 cars on the road. I pulled into the little parking lot and parked. I stepped out and called Dan's phone again. The guy picked up and he spoke in a noticeably lower voice now. I told him I was in the parking lot of the pub, and he said he was as well. He said in almost a whisper, "I'll be right over," and he hung up. It was weirder in the moment than it sounds explaining it. I looked at the location on my phone to see if it was updating, but it seemed the location of Dan's phone was in the small patch of woods about 200 feet long and 200 feet wide. I tried calling again and it went straight to voicemail. I looked around the whole parking lot but didn't see anyone. I was all alone, not even an occasional passing car. I looked to the woods when I heard something over the sound of the crickets, like someone's footsteps, and then I saw a man. It was him. He was standing just behind the tree line between the woods and the parking lot. He called to me, "Are you alone?" The sight of him, only his upper body visible, was freaky as hell. I called back, "No, why?" as I inched my way closer to my car. This was one giant red flag. He called back, "Who are you with?" I didn't answer that. I got in my car and drove back to base. I called my supervisor and told him Dan was missing and someone was hiding in a patch of woods with his phone. My supervisor told me he was with Dan at that moment. He told me to meet them at the small building by the flight line. I met with the 2 and told them once again what I witnessed when tracking his phone. Dan told me what happened while off the base. He was approached by somebody outside of a 24/7 convenience store asking for a ride back to the base. Dan believed that he was actually in the Air Force at first and let him in the car. But as they were driving, the man asked Dan to pull over by the woods so he could pee real quick. Dan obliged for some reason. As Dan was pulled to the side of the road by the same small patch of woods by Tony, he wasn't paying attention for a minute and his door was opened by the man. Without a second to even react, the man was grabbing Dan's arms and squeezing them as he tried to pull him out of the car. Dan said he kicked at the man's groin area until he let go. He dropped his phone and it fell out of the car during the struggle, but as he was free, he drove the car away with the door still open at first. The next thing that happened was he went back to the base to talk with our supervisor. We, of course, called the police and all went to Tony to check if the man was still there. The location of Dan's phone was no longer popping up on the map. It's possible the man destroyed the phone. All we did was file a police report. Some people out there are actually crazy and dangerous. Who knows what he would have done to either of us if he had gotten us in the woods. I chose a very poor time to join the Army. The plan was to join the Army as an engineer, serve for a few years, then use the money and skills I'd build up to open an auto repair shop over. I signed on for a 6-year minimum contract, but then 2 years in, Australia got involved in Vietnam. We'd had advisors in before that, working to train up the South Vietnamese, but no one expected it to escalate in such a way. I certainly didn't, anyway. And if it did, I thought being an engineer would keep me out of harm's way, for the most part at least. But oh, how wrong I was. In late 1967, I was summoned to the office of my company commander, and when I arrived in his office, he had a sheet of paper in front of him. He gave me a look over, then asked me if I was indeed just 5 foot 5 inches tall and 70 kilos. I told him yes, that I'd always been short and skinny, but that I'd passed all the relevant Army tests as well as meeting all the minimum height and weight requirements. And that's what I thought it was about. You see, I got it into my head that they were trying to kick me out because of my smaller stature. It turns out that quite the opposite was true. The Army wanted men of my size very badly indeed, and that's because of a very special kind of job that only we could perform, a job that would earn us the name Tunnel Rats. Along with about 100 other guys, I was sent back to the Army School of Military Engineering near Sydney, where we underwent a 3-month crash course in what was called tunnel clearance. To counter the threat of air power, the Vietnamese communists had taken to living underground as a means of avoiding detection. It was such an effective technique that our ground forces were forced to come up with a means of flushing them out. We tried everything: grenades, dogs, tear gas. The Yanks even tried flooding them with water at one point. But the only thing we sent down those holes that was really effective were people. And to fit down there, you needed to be short and skinny, just like I was. We crawled through a few replica tunnels the instructors had built, but the meat and potatoes came down to the kind of combat we were told to expect. Most of the fighting in Vietnam was in really dense jungle, and from a lot of the stories I heard, you rarely got a look at the Viet Zone during a firefight. But in the case of us tunnel rats, we would be getting up close and personal with the enemy, so close you could touch them, in fact. More often than not, you had no choice but to lay hands on them because the fighting down in those tunnels was quite literally hand-to-hand. You went down into the tunnels with a handgun, a flashlight, and a knife, sometimes a rope to tug on if you needed help, but that's about it. You could use the handgun if you really needed to, but shooting in such a dark and enclosed space could really mess up your eyes and ears, so it was always a last resort kind of thing. The enemy tended to just flee if they knew we were in the tunnels, and we post blocking forces to try and cut off their escape. But every so often, you had to get your hands dirty. Ideally, you wanted to sneak up on a bloke, clamp your hand over his mouth, and stab the Jesus out of him before he knew what was happening. That way, you could either keep going or go back to warn the rest of your mates without the enemy knowing you were there. But after a while, the enemy got wise to what we were doing, and they really wanted to take us out of the game. They started building booby traps into the walls of the tunnels, mostly things like tripwire grenades. But some tunnels had false walls or floors where the Viet could hide before plunging a bamboo spear into our bellies. There was even one instance where an American tunnel rat claimed to have found a booby trap consisting entirely of live snakes. The had dug out a little hole in the bottom of one tunnel, then tossed some highly venomous pit vipers in there. There were even mouse or rat droppings dotting the little enclosure where they had clearly been feeding them rodents to keep them alive. They started doing a lot of that sort of thing after the tunnel clearance program really got going, just baiting us sometimes so they could kill our blokes. We heard that a Viet Cong got a big-time reward for killing a tunnel rat, and rightly so. It wasn't like you could train any soldier to do the job. The army only had a finite supply of smaller, skinnier soldiers blokes, and the more we lost, the more strain the job put on you. We were also faced with a massive problem when it came to taking casualties. 90% of the time, if the Viets got the better of a tunnel rat, he was a goner. But we couldn't just leave the bodies down there, we had to recover them. The same thing applied if a bloke was wounded, we had to send another man down there to drag them out. This was obviously very dangerous, as the Viets were experts at setting traps and ambushes. So, trying to rescue one guy might result in 2 or 3 other tunnel rats being killed or wounded in the process. And that's how I ended up buying my ticket home in June of 1969. Me and another tunnel rat we called Victor were flown from our base at Nui Dat to a place called Kawachai. We'd be joining the 5th Battalion of the Royal France Regiment for what they were calling Operation Esso, which amounted to a month's worth of mine disposal and tunnel clearance in the area of Kawachai. We worked staggered shifts in teams of 2, and that day was our day, so off we went. The moment we landed, some infantry sergeant ran up to the helicopter and told us we were needed at a tunnel system about 2 kilometers from the landing zone. They had been mapping out the tunnel system for weeks, making a note of all the entrances they could find. They weren't easy to locate either, being these small holes with wood panel covers that were very easily concealed. Anyway, they mapped out the tunnels, put a few blocking forces in place, and all we needed to do was flush out the Viet Cong so the other platoons could pick them off. When we arrived at the entrance the sergeant wanted us to start with, Victor told me he wanted to be the first one in so he could at least get a feel for the place before we both went down together, if it even came to that. He went down, rope tied around the hand, holding his pistol with him, and said that he'd be back in a few minutes. But then a few minutes went by, and there was no sign of Victor. As you can probably imagine, the rope that he held kept extending and extending as he moved forward, so we knew everything was A-okay. Every so often, the rope would stop for a few seconds where Victor was just waiting and listening or checking out his surroundings, I assume, but it would always start moving again in a moment or two. But then it stopped and didn't start moving again. After I gave the line a few tugs and Victor didn't tug back, I really started to worry. I tried my best to wait a few minutes before heading down. I hadn't heard any gunshots or anything that might indicate he was in trouble, but him being so still for so long wasn't a good sign. After a minute or so ticked by and there was still no movement, I got down into the tunnel myself to check on Victor. Generally speaking, there were 2 kinds of tunnels here. The larger tunnels connected all the various underground facilities the Viet Cong had down there. They had field hospitals, armories, even bloody classrooms so their leaders could indoctrinate them with all that bloody Marxism stuff. But then there were the smaller tunnels, the kind closer to the surface where you literally had to crawl along on your belly to get anywhere, and it was this kind that I found myself in that morning. It was pitch black, and I didn't need to use my flashlight. All I had to do to find Victor was follow the rope he was holding. So, that's what I did, moved as quiet as a mouse, just hoping I wasn't about to crawl into a trap. Eventually, after a couple of minutes of crawling, I felt my hand touch the bottom of Victor's boot. I stayed quiet as I gave it a nudge, but Victor didn't move. He was dead, probably killed by some Viet Cong who then ran off to warn his mates. If that was the case, then job done, the blocking forces could do their thing. It just seemed unfair that the result came at the cost of my mate's life. To make sure that there was nothing restricting Victor's body before I tried to pull it out, I switched on my flashlight to take a look around. The smaller tunnels were tiny, but there was just about enough room to lift your head up a little bit. That way, I could use my flashlight to look ever so slightly over Victor's body. But when I did, it resulted in the single most heart-stopping moment of terror I had ever experienced. I didn't get a good look at the bloke. I didn't have time, really. But when I switched on my flashlight, there was this Viet Cong on the other side of Victor's body, and he had a pistol aimed right at my flashlight. I dropped down straight away, trying to get as low as possible. The guy must have shot where the light was, and I know I must have blinded him a bit, so his first few shots went over me. I know this because I felt the earth hitting the back of my neck from where the Viet Cong's bullets were smashing into the tunnel ceiling. The noise was deafening, well and truly, and as much as I saw the flashes from where he kept on shooting at me, I didn't really hear the shots, not properly, anyway. The only thing that kept his bullets from killing me was Victor's body, and if he wasn't dead when I found him, it certainly was by the time it came to dragging him out. The guy shooting at me quickly extended his pistol clip and had to back out of the tunnel to rearm. When I carried on dragging Victor's body the opposite way, I could hear the bloke shouting for his friends in Vietnamese, and I knew it was only a matter of time before more bullets came flying in my direction. All I could do was focus on dragging Victor, telling myself I still might be able to save his life if I just get him out of that bloody tunnel in time. I could hear the rest of my mates shouting on the surface. They'd heard the gunfire and were willing me to drag myself out of the tunnel in one piece. I almost made it out without a scratch too, but as I reached the tunnel entrance and raised myself up to climb out, I heard another round of muffled gunfire before a bullet smashed into my left knee. I know it belongs to get themselves shot, and because of all the adrenaline, they don't feel a bloody thing unless it breaks a bone or something. Jesus Christ, the pain I felt when my kneecap shattered into a dozen little pieces was like nothing I'd ever felt before or since. If it wasn't for the guys who grabbed me under the armpits and dragged me out of that hole, I might have already lost one or both legs to a spray of Chinese-supplied bullets. Like I might have already said, that bullet wound was my ticket home. I was flown back, stitched up, put into a rehab program, and then I was back on duty. Thankfully, I didn't have to go back overseas, but I did serve about 18 more months teaching tunnel rats how to do that job. This experience has left me very paranoid in a lot of ways. It was the late hours of the night. I could feel the thud of my heartbeat inside my chest as our armored vehicle veered off the gravel road, plowing through the dense underbrush. It had been weeks since Bravo unit had gone silent, vanishing like a wisp of smoke on a windy day. The distress call had crackled through our comms earlier, an unexpected sign of life from our long-missing comrades. But what haunted me more than their sudden re-emergence was the content of their message, a cryptic string of numbers repeating endlessly. "Sergeant Robert, are you sure this is the place?" I asked over the static hiss of the radio, cutting through the silence that had settled over our squad. "That's what command confirmed." "Get ready," Robert replied as our vehicle came to a halt. The dense fog seemed to get worse as we disembarked into the unknown, the silence of the abandoned base growing increasingly unsettling. Buildings stood like hollowed-out husks with windows shattered, doors ajar, a living town not even a few weeks ago, now just a ghost town. Robert ordered us in a whisper to stay sharp as we moved forward, our boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Signs of a struggle were everywhere, overturned furniture, bloodied rags, and scattered ammunition littered the ground, painting a picture of the chaos that had taken place here recently. The base, once a bustling hub of military activity, was eerily silent now except for our own shallow breaths and the distant echoing cry of the numbers broadcast. As we neared the command center, the transmission grew louder, a constant chant that seemed to bore into my mind, its meaning as elusive as the shadows in the fog surrounding us. Entering the command center, we found it abandoned, the air stale, the only light coming from the blinking consoles. The radio speakers crackling with static repeated the sequence over and over in a monotone voice, 58247, 5824. Corporal Titus, what does it mean? I saw her eyes wide as she scanned the room. Commander Donald might have known, Robert said. Commander Donald was the name of the unit's leader who had vanished along with his team. We continued our search through the desolate base, hoping to find a clue, a survivor, anything. But it was the laboratory that changed everything. The door was ajar, hanging off its hinges as if forced open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and chemicals. Shattered vials and overturned equipment were signs of activity halted abruptly. Then we saw them, bodies, members of Bravo unit, or what was left of them, sprawled across the floor, their faces contorted in expressions of terror. It was a massacre, but the cause was unclear. No bullet wounds, no signs of struggle on their remains. Then Titus gestured toward a corner of the room. There, amidst the pile of research notes and hastily abandoned experiments, lay the body of Commander Donald. Clutched in his stiff, lifeless hand was a notepad, the numbers 58247 scrawled across it in shaky handwriting, followed by a single chilling sentence: "They're coming for us." The revelation struck us like a physical blow, the implications of his words spiraling into a million questions with no answers. Who was coming for them? Was this distress call not a beacon of hope but a warning? It was then that the reality situation descended upon us, the isolation, the eerie silence broken only by that relentless strain of numbers. We were not the rescuers, we were the next victims. Panic set in as the base seemed to close in on us. The fog outside felt like it was thickening. Our only choice was to flee. We ran, stumbling through the fog, guided by the distant light of our vehicle. The numbers continued to echo in my mind, a chant that seemed to follow us, whispering through the fog. Just as the vehicle came into view, a shadow emerged from the mist. A chill colder than death itself crawled up my spine as the strange man, cloaked in shadow, moved towards us. "We need to go now," Robert's shout snapped me back to reality, the urgency in his voice mirroring a primal fear within me. Our training had prepared us for many different types of enemies, but we had no idea what we were dealing with here. We scrambled into the vehicle. Titus's hands were shaking as she manned the communications with obvious fear and shaking in her voice. "This is Stephen Unit calling command. Mayday, Mayday. We need immediate extraction from Zone Bravo. Do you copy? Over." The radio crackled, the numbers interrupting her plea for help: 58247. I couldn't shake the feeling that those numbers held some kind of meaning to what we had stumbled into. As the base faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, so too did the person who emerged from the shadows. Yet the terror it inspired lingered. As we raced toward an uncertain future, Robert broke the silence and said, "We can't let this end here. We need to find out what those numbers mean and what happened to Bravo Unit." I wanted nothing more than to find these things out as well. I felt like we owed it to them, thinking of the twisted, lifeless bodies we'd left behind. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the darkness, I felt a grim determination settle over me. We had survived the night, but the real battle felt like it was just beginning. Armed with nothing but a string of numbers and the haunting memories of what we had witnessed, the mystery of those numbers and the horrors of what could have happened to Bravo Unit still remain a mystery. It stays with me, haunting me. I'm sure it stays with everyone from my unit. The horrors at that base were just a chapter in a story far greater and more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.